Hello and welcome to my epic assessment of all the superhero movies from the year 2019. This is an annual video series that documents my thoughts on the ever-growing collection of these films that are pumped out every year, in an attempt to see if they are generally getting better, more tiresome, or simply staying the same. 2019 was about as packed as 2018 was, with a slightly more varied selection that branches off beyond action or comedy, to mixed degrees of success. Personally, it was a fairly weak year for what I'm looking for out of these types of movies, but there are a couple I still enjoy nonetheless. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about the 2019 films in order, starting with my least favorite and gradually going through, you guessed it, to my favorite. If you don't care about the film I'm talking about or simply want to pick and choose based around which movies you're interested in, there are time codes in the description for each separate movie. Also note, I'm not including Hellboy in this video because I've talked about it before in my worst of 2019 video, so go watch that if you care. Otherwise, you know it'll be near the bottom of this list. So with that said, let's start with what I think is the weakest superhero movie of 2019 and go from there. Also note, I'll be spoiling elements of these movies, so you've been warned. You've had plenty of time. M. Night uses the third movie in the East Rail 177 trilogy to shock us with the knowledge that comic books have tropes.
That sounds like the bad guys teaming up.
Unbreakable was a fresh spin on a genre that wasn't nearly as prevalent in cinema as it is today, whereas Split was a fairly entertaining thriller with the twist being that it was actually set in the same universe as Unbreakable. In between Unbreakable and Glass is an entire 19 years worth of superhero renaissance that has shifted pop culture to the point where the nerd schlock you used to get bullied for liking is now what's widely popular. So when we get to Glass, and they treat this meta comic book commentary as if we're still in the golden or silver age of comic books.
And then, Action Comics #1 launched, with the man in the cape and the blue tights on the cover. Booyah! Here we are.
I'm leaving.
It makes the film come across as if it's completely ignorant to its contemporaries.
I think you believe water is your weakness.
And even if you're not twinged by the lack of subtlety or wit behind the obvious themes,
This was an origin story the whole time.
I'm leaving.
what you're left with is a poorly executed drama with mystery elements that never feel surprising or earned. Sorry about that, M. Night.
Yeah.
Hey, do I know you? Did you used to work at the football stadium?
Despite being the title character, Mr. Glass doesn't actually say a single word until over an hour into the runtime. What makes up this dead hour is a collection of scenes that pose the question that the three superpowered individuals might in fact be mentally ill all along, and they've perhaps imagined their superpowered realities. This is a story element I could imagine working if this trilogy was more cohesive and not written around twists or reveals being the pinnacle of what their stories have to offer, but it doesn't. So it's stupid.
I truly am a mastermind.
Bruce Willis is doing what modern Bruce Willis does best in looking like a jaded old man who is clearly only there for one reason. James McAvoy is a great performer, obviously as is Samuel Jackson and Bruce Willis when he wants to be, but his character here doesn't particularly have room to grow, aside from a retroactive Fast and Furious tier reveal, where it turns out that Sam Jackson was responsible for killing James McAvoy's father, which means he's responsible for everything.
I created you as I created David.
In truth, the real villain here is the script, which has no clear momentum, feels stitched together, and is simultaneously being pulled in countless directions. Are you a small-budget Blumhouse mystery thriller set in some spooky mental institute? Are you a sequel to Unbreakable? Are you a continuation to Split? Are you a small-scale psychological thriller that tests the minds of the main characters? Are you a large-scale superhero tale built around commenting on genre tropes in a crowded, cynical market? Maybe if the dialogue wasn't attempting this obnoxious cleverness quite as much, then I would have been okay with it.
A collection of main characters.
Or at least more okay with it. But otherwise, it's an utterly forgettable, belated entry into a crowded genre that doesn't need it. I would not recommend this movie to anyone, especially to those who are fans of Unbreakable and or Split.
The power of true, loving, physical affection. It's like something supernatural.
What would happen if Superman was a satanic sociopath, murderer, Maniac is the best way to summarize Brightburn. Made on a micro budget and the clout of riding off the loose connection to James Gunn, this film winds up being a largely uninteresting what-if kind of supervillain horror story. It seems like work never delved much deeper than the initial easy-to-pitch concept, so you get a fairly surface-level plot that is more interested in rushing to get to the slasher movie kills and exploitation of the subject instead of anything with a little more complexity or cleverness to chew on. The overall production was fairly weak. I was especially bothered by some of the dialogue and performances.
He's so different.
It's called puberty.
It came across as if the more well-known actors signed on to the movie as a favor, as there really isn't much more to glean from the movie than the premise. Some of the B-movie level kills are humorous here and there. Oh look, it's Badger. But I think this idea would be better suited to a more concise short, or given to a team to develop into something with a little bit more direction and personality and breadth. As it stands though, I think this concept is better left to your imagination. I can't help but feel sorry for this movie. I don't know what it is about it, but it feels as if it's been defeated, trodden on.
My emotions make me strong.
The colour and life is sucked so bare from this franchise at this point that by this entry, it really is not surprising that events transpired the way they did.
This primitive species.
To be as fair as possible to the film, not only was it going up against one of the most anticipated event movies of all time, while also containing similarities so severe to Captain Marvel that huge portions of the film had to be reshot and moved around, as well as being the sequel to the largely disregarded X-Men Apocalypse, as well as this being the second adaptation of the Dark Pheonix storyline on the big screen. Oh yeah, and let's not forget, this was also post the news that Disney bought Fox, so this universe was on the chopping block, no matter how good it was. This entire project was fucked from the start. It's a shame too, as much as the quality shifts wildly around these X-Men movies, there were some genuinely quite good ones, so it is kind of disappointing that this is the full stop it ends on. This movie treats its characters as if they're more familiar to us than they actually are. In fact, for the Dark Pheonix storyline to have any impact, it's fairly essential for you to be invested in a number of different characters, least of all being Jean Grey herself, who I suppose is kind of the protagonist?
You a little intimidated, maybe?
Who we were only introduced to in the forgettable previous entry, which I already mentioned was a pretty bad movie. The story itself has some ambitious beats on paper. The idea of Professor X having to overcome his hubris and overconfidence and deal with past mistakes is alluring, but executed in a bare-bones and frustrating way, and as usual, when the best characters from the series are on screen, it tends to be a lot more entertaining.
You messed with the mind of an 8-year-old girl. You pushed down all...
However, the core of the movie is Jean Grey and her entanglement with the Dabari, a race of shape-shifting aliens who were originally going to be the Skrull, but Captain Marvel used them, so they had to change it. Feels like a lot of development is missing from this movie. Not that I particularly want it to be any longer, but there's a jumbled messiness to its goals that leave it being overall unsatisfying. For some incredibly confusing reason, the director decided to take Logan as a source of inspiration for the visual language of the movie. Now, I really enjoy Logan, but they constrained that movie so much with the Western-inspired dirt and grit to assist the style and tone they were going for that story. Shooting everything handheld, intimate, lifeless, and colorless for an X-Men story as grand in scope as Dark Pheonix was clearly a mistake. If they'd taken any aspect from Logan, I wish it was the appreciation for the smaller scale, more character-driven stories that lean away from the apocalyptic superhero movie outcomes, but that's not the reality we live in, so we're left with this. And neither a Hans Zimmer score nor the gravitas of some of the cast can carry this material. It's just dead on arrival. Sometimes a project just doesn't come together. I do feel for the director given the context of the situation, as trying to play anything from the horrendous set of cards he was dealt must have been horrifying. Despite it all though, at least our emotions keep us strong.
My emotions make me strong.
Now, I usually don't bother with these straight-to-video animated DC or Marvel movies, but something about this one caught my eye. It seems like such a long time since Batman has been in anything watchable. I have a fond memory of the 90s animated Batman series and movies like Mask of the Phantasm, and wanted to see what the kids these days are getting in comparison. Let's just say it's different.
Sure you can. Ass.
First off, and this could be personal bias talking, but I really am not the biggest fan of the art direction of Hush and this tier of DC animated movie. I don't think it's bad particularly, it just seems to be limited. My bigger issue than any artistic taste, though, is with where they choose to take the Hush story compared to the more well-known version fanboys like me might know. I'm not particularly a purist of the source material by any means, but that is with the caveat that you justify the changes you make based on the medium you're working in. But if you're selling a story based on a known comic and then right at the end you change it for the sake of misdirection, then you're falling into a similar trap that Arkham Knight did, but kind of in reverse. Instead of promising something new and delivering a reskin of a well-known story, they're promising something familiar and delivering a mix-up that entirely changes the story. Perhaps if they'd just gone for a different name other than Batman Hush, then this wouldn't have bothered me as much. Aside from that, this story has a lot of characters in it, so it can feel overly stuffed and kind of like a crossover event. There's a lot of fan service and some wince-worthy dialogue.
Say, perfect.
Perfect.
They really lean hard into the tween edginess with the sex and death, which can be a little distracting when at the same time they're spouting despicable Me Too lines such as,
You and Selena. Bruce Selena?
If they didn't change the story around, then I probably would have enjoyed it a little more, but as it is, I can't say that my journey back into the DC animated catalogue was worth my time. There was also a Justice League and Wonder Woman animated movie that came out the same year, but I don't have the fortitude to sit through any more than what is truly relevant or necessary. I already had to watch Glass, already had to rewatch Captain Marvel, and if they're all like this, what's even the point?
Sure you can. Ass.
I can't help but think the positioning of Captain Marvel is what sours it the most. The insistence to interrupt the story we care about for a mostly unrelated flashback that primarily exists to set up Deus Ex Machinas in future movies is a huge slight against this story and any potential it could have. By no means is it offensively bad, it's just kind of a Thor tier Marvel origin fish out of water movie, wedged in between two juggernauts of build-up. Who thought that was a good idea? Oh, it made $1 billion, whatever. I simply do not care about the protagonist, I'm sorry. Let's start with her powers. She's gifted with the power of having cosmic abilities because she's absorbed the energy from a Tesseract-derived speed engine, which gives her the unique talent of being able to smash things really hard. That's how she solves every issue, just smash it.
I will burn you to the ground.
To me, the best superheroes have some kind of hook or flaw to their character that makes them inherently magnetic. The Hulk is torn between bodies like Jekyll and Hyde. Spider-Man is just an ordinary kid who has to juggle the responsibility of being a hero with school life. Captain Marvel has amnesia. Everyone's favorite backstory, the amnesia backstory. But not only does she have amnesia, but by the end of the movie, she remembers every detail of her life. So she's actually in a pretty good place as far as characters go. I really don't know where they're going to take Captain Marvel in the future, but I can't say as of yet I'm very impressed with what I've seen. What about her am I supposed to care about aside from the fact that she is completely unstoppable, which could potentially be used to tell a story about the corruption of absolute power or something more gripping like that, but in this instance she's more like a side character that was given the protagonist role.
My name is Carol.
The movie almost seems self-aware of how tepid it is, doing everything in its power to take your mind off the main character's journey. They do this by relegating most of the substance to the supporting roles. Barely half an hour passes before Mr. Glass hijacks the movie to turn it into this light-hearted buddy cop type of action spectacle. One side of the story I genuinely did quite enjoy was the spin on where they decided to take the Skrull shape-shifting aliens. They look goofy and ridiculous, sure, but they found a fresh angle to take these creatures that the MCU hasn't really explored before. It's a shame that the other pillars of the movie were not as satisfying or surprising though. The humor is bloody all over the place. It's about as broad as you'd expect.
Yes, that's right.
I had to sleepwalk my way through the second viewing of this movie. The first time around I was kind of led along by the fact that it is connected to Endgame, but now the dust has settled, it does seem quite apparent that they used everyone's passion for the Avengers to get people to watch this utterly forgettable, bland movie about an unbeatable cosmic destroyer. They've got their work cut out for them if they plan to have Captain Marvel as a mainstay that's supposed to be as likable as the other Avengers. I'm always a sucker for Spider-Man, so I was ready and willing to proceed post-Endgame with something a little more intimate, a little less weighty, more silly, just a stupid comic book movie. It took me a couple of rewatches to enjoy Spider-Man Homecoming, but unfortunately I kind of had the opposite happen here. Once I saw this in theaters, I quite enjoyed it, but upon rewatching at home, I have to say I wasn't nearly as pleased with how this sequel shakes out. It has a very similar feel to Homecoming, not surprisingly, as much of the same crew returned, which in turn brings with it similar criticisms. The production is equally flat as it is bland.
It's clear to me that you were not ready for this.
The overall lack of energy to the presentation does the character a real disservice. This is Spider-Man. It is irritating once you notice how a lot of the dialogue scenes are just two cameras, shot reverse shot, especially when you contrast that to how much more creative and free the movement is when everything in the movie turns into a computer-generated cartoon. Obviously, the villain of the week this time was Mysterio, which is a classic Spidey story that they do a decent job of updating to make sense for this universe. I almost wish there was a little bit more of him. Unfortunately, Peter doesn't have a particularly vibrant character arc. They half attempt a similar idea to the original Spider-Man 2, where it's about the hero having a crisis of faith in themselves, but instead of learning to become the best Spider-Man he can be, he more transitions into being the best Iron Man he can be. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but it does seem pretty blatant that this movie is more of a platform to establish Spider-Man as one of the new mainstay characters to fill the boots of Iron Man. Tom Holland is only young, so he's got, 30 more Spider-Man movies left in him? I'm conflicted on how to feel about this Iron Spider-Man thing. On one hand, it does make a lot of sense based on the Peter they've set up in this universe specifically, but at the same time I hope it doesn't mean he's going to be shifted into this weird little Iron Man fanboy who constantly lives in his shadow. The story itself is extremely silly and takes a good hour before the fun side of the plot kicks in. I gotta say the first act in particular drags on rewatch. The whole weapon glasses plot device was very cartoony, and there were just too many moments of tiresome conflict that were derived in an extremely forced way. It's one of those stories that gets worse and more stupid the more you think about it. The humor was a little bit better than the average Marvel movie, because luckily the cast is a lot of humorous people with fairly good chemistry. There are definitely some stinker jokes in there though. I might be sounding overly harsh on this movie because I do like it, but it's just fine. I don't think it's as good as Homecoming, and I definitely do not feel the need to revisit this anytime soon. I do think the after credits scene was a nice bit of fan service, and it sets up the next movie to potentially be a lot of fun. Oh yeah, and it was funny how Peter refers to his dick as a web shooter.
It's a little tight around the old web shooter.
Randomly, this is the second superhero movie on this list to contain a car crash caused by a small child, although this time the movie it's from is a lot more entertaining. Shazam works because it has a great hook. A kid that can effectively turn into Superman with the utterance of a single word is a cute idea. They have fun with the premise and apply just the right amount of motivation and melodrama to make this a pleasant experience. This movie has less smooth edges compared to some of the other titans on this list. However, the humor and tone stay consistent and likable throughout. The tone is a lot more comedically successful than the more recent DC offerings, if you ignore the inherent humor in what they've been attempting. So it's about time one of these movies established a character I actually want to see more of, who has a fun gimmick that has plenty of room for setups in the future. Mark Strong is given a surprising amount of screen time, which helps to establish the motivations and tribulations of the character. I always enjoy seeing him do his thing. I enjoy the way they deal with magic, in which they basically don't explain anything and mostly leave it to your imagination. The film has fairly simple rules to it, so the antics involving Shazam, switching around body forms as to problem solve, are fun to watch. And this movie is not afraid to show its villains being truly villainous. The most standout example being the boardroom scene where the 7 deadly sins eviscerate a bunch of rich people. It comes across as earnest and passionate to the source material, despite a clear tinge of self-awareness, with more subtle nods to the audience than breaking the fourth wall and Deadpooling them.
Shazam.
Are you for real?
There's just something very likable about this movie, and a dash of purity and wholesomeness is much appreciated in a time where every other superhero movie is about the fucking apocalypse, or society driving people crazy, or giant sharks fighting giant crabs. I do have some issues. While I think most of the humor is pretty good overall, there is a lot of it that goes on for just a tad too long for my liking, and a fair amount of it is clearly aimed at a younger audience than me, so it can feel fairly kiddie at points, which I suppose is appropriate considering who the main cast of characters are and what movie we're talking about. Speaking of, the main cast are generally pretty good. The standouts being Zachary Levi as Shazam, Mark Strong as the villain, and the kid from It. The main character has a compelling arc tied around his abandonment issues that reminds me of the fucking legendary Kung Fu Panda 2, all tied up with a satisfying conclusion ending with a silly fight in an amusement park, where I do have to admit that I check out a little bit. Give it a watch though if you want a movie that just feels like a classic superhero movie. On Sardonicast, where I co-host with YMS and Ralph the Movie Maker, we did an interview with the director of Shazam, David F. Sandberg, which you should check out if that kind of thing sounds compelling to you. Joker, a Joaquin Pheonix film, it's pretty good. Can't give it many points for originality, but as far as running with the premise of Joker origin story taken deathly seriously with a bunch of socio-political commentary, then it gets a thumbs up. I've seen it twice now, and I felt pretty similar on both viewings. Even bringing up the Taxi Driver and King of Comedy comparisons is a dead topic at this point, but it's specifically the direct similarities with the King of Comedy's story structure that bothered me the most. I guess I was more just shocked that when they said they were taking inspiration from intimate Martin Scorsese character studies, that they would be quite so literal. Besides, the movie doesn't even attempt to hide its connections to Scorsese at all. In fact, it embraces its similarities with direct acknowledgement through the form of De Niro playing a very similar character to the one he himself harassed in The King of Comedy. The pessimist in me flashes forward to a future where we've exhausted all sources of mindless spectacle, thus have to farm heralded films for their narrative frameworks to build spin-off superhero-related properties around. The optimist in me hopes that the other studios will probably take away the wrong aspects from the success of this movie, and that ultimately it probably won't have a negative rippling effect on the film's industry. The fact of the matter is, though, this film is connected with countless people, even if I'm a little more mixed on it myself. I joked earlier about Joaquin Pheonix, but he really is the donkey who is carrying this movie on his back. His performance is frightening and vulnerable when it needs to be. The payoff of the movie for me is the haunting moment where Joker murders De Niro. The build-up and culmination is satisfying to witness. There's a purposefully overbearing and edgy comic book tone, with the intense music and the beauty and the filth and grime of the city. Production-wise, it's certainly much more interesting and moody than anything else on this list. The spin on Joker's laugh is possibly the most ingenious thing about it, portraying a beaten, tortured soul who has a crippling condition that forces him to laugh about it, has a nice tinge of irony, and obviously leads to some creepy and inappropriate moments that build a lot of personality for the character. Somehow everything about this movie was iconic, for good or bad, from the moment the trailers appeared. The number of memes and arguments and ridiculous news story this movie caused kind of makes it stand out, simply for being a film that represents the zeitgeist of the time. My major takeaway from the story itself was this morbidly compelling depiction of an innocent victim being pushed over the edge by variables that were effectively completely out of his control. As you later find out, Arthur was adopted into an incredibly abusive household, so he really stood no chance from the beginning. As far as this concept goes of taking DC characters and grounding them in small-scale character studies, I do think it's the perfect contrast to Marvel. However, they're also trying to be Marvel at the same time, so I really don't understand who's wearing the hat over there. It is kind of confusing as an audience member what DC movies count and which don't, if you get what I'm saying. Besides, any kind of fresh take or direction is desperately needed and appreciated in this subgenre if they want to keep making these grotesque billion-dollar intakes. Can't all just copy each other forever. You gotta copy old movies now. Gotta go back into the vault. My biggest problem with the story by far is the inclusion of the imagined woman, which is inherently kind of predictable based on the reality of the situation. I don't believe for a second that this woman and child would have anything to do with someone this blatantly terrifying.
So funny, Arthur.
I understand the choice to include it as an attempt to add a layer of confusion and sophistication. It just feels a little half-baked and unearned. I think with a tighter script, this could have been something I would have enjoyed a little bit more. But the surprising amount of relevance this film garners in these trying times is certainly an aspect that is beginning to grow on me. I'll be very interested to see how this film ages, because I really don't know what the read is going to be.
You just ask the same questions every week.
Joker has a lot of undeniably great things about it, but the overall package doesn't promote much emotion from me. I understand that it works for a lot of people as a standalone piece, but as I was leaving the theater for the first time, I couldn't help but overhear some giddy members of the audience exclaim about how they cannot wait for a sequel to see how Batman deals with this problem, which made me realize that there are simply so many ways to read this movie that I really do not feel the need to justify why I don't like it more than I do. If I do wind up watching this film again, it will probably be for that lead performance and the overall oppressive, hopeless feel of it, but I can't say it's an experience I'm vying for very often when I can just open up Twitter. I would recommend watching it though if you somehow haven't already. Even the prospect of a chance of an extreme reaction is a hell of a lot more to offer than many of its contemporaries. Many. Which is perhaps why I have Joker so high on this list. Although I would highly recommend watching Taxi Driver and especially The King of Comedy if you want to understand where the comparisons, criticisms, and references are coming from. This film feels like the season finale of a show that has had some really good episodes, a couple of stinkers, but overall was a mostly consistent, fun bit of pulpy pop culture. There's such a feeling of finality to Endgame. The fact there's no tease in the end credits is actually kind of a big deal for one of these movies. They were actually finally able to finish something with conclusiveness. With multiple contracts running out, we knew there were going to be casualties, but we didn't know exactly how it was going to go down. The electricity around this movie was fairly palpable. I'm not like the biggest fan in the world of the MCU or anything, but even I was sucked into the excitement for the unprecedented level of scope that I knew was before me. I was a big fan of Infinity War, so I was interested to see how they were going to wrap this up, how they were going to worm their way out of the cliffhanger they teased everyone with. And did they manage to pull it off in a satisfying way? Yeah, I'm not head over heels for this movie, but I actually think that given its intent, it pretty much knocks it out of the park. Tony Stark and Captain America get perfect endings for their characters. I couldn't ask for a better way to conclude their stories. And there was something genuinely touching about seeing Tony and Captain grapple with the years worth of build-up of flaws, choices, and mistakes that have all built to this point. A standout moment for me being the silly but poignant interaction Tony has with his dad in the past.
Thank you.
It's nice to see how much these characters have developed over time. It makes your investment feel like it was all worth it. This is the great payoff. That's part of what has kept me intrigued by these characters. The majority of them are so deeply flawed that they tend to be quite easy to relate to. At the end of it all, Captain America just wanted to spend his entire life dancing with Hayley Atwell and probably Hulk smashing her every night, and there's something beautiful about that. I really think the Ant-Man movies are incredibly forgettable on their own, but the character particularly shines here. Paul Rudd does a fantastic job playing the everyman who is out of his element, and his emotional beats work surprisingly well, considering how little I care about his own movies. He's an integral aspect to the story this time around, with his Ant-Man technology being required for the time travel element of the movie. On my first viewing, I have to admit, I was fairly disappointed by the time travel reveal, fearing a webbed future where the timeline gets so complicated that you need multiple books and charts to even understand the context of what you're watching. On revisiting, it is something that I find easier to wrap my head around, and I really can't get too annoyed at the fact they're traveling through time when we're talking about the same universe that has magic people that can open portals with sentient capes and radiated superhumans and duck people. Like, the way they pair up certain characters is just as clever as it was in Infinity War, and those payoff moments are the type of fan service that is completely justified no matter how crowd-pleasing they are. They do such a good job of coming up with a good excuse to return to classic moments from earlier movies, even if one of them is from arguably one of the weakest Marvel movies yet, Thor: The Dark World. Despite how extended and tonally ranged this movie is, it somehow manages to build up to an Aquaman level of true hype that breaks the realm of epic scale. And we're just at the point where there's so much shit happening on screen, but it's not so crazy that you can't tell what's going on. Just like Infinity War, the action is strongest when it's kept small scale and precise. The moment you have Captain Marvel flying through ships and Pegasus is flying around, it gets harder for me to stay invested or take it seriously. In saying that though, the movie really does peak at this moment.
That kid on the TV just called me a dickhead again.
Captain Marvel does rob a couple of major pieces of tension, weight, and drama from the movie for me, because she can just show up and solve any problem. It is still a bizarre choice for them to establish a new character in between a two-part special that has such an integral role in the story, but who also has virtually no personal stakes in the conflict beyond her vague stance as a cosmic super soldier. I know it's only a couple moments, but this really does bug me. There's gonna be time for Captain Marvel in the future. I'm fine with you establishing this character in this universe. It's just so strange to me that they chose to wedge her in now.
Hey, Peter Parker.
The scene where Hawkeye and Black Widow compete to commit suicide is kind of a miss for me. I like the emotion of where it concludes, but there is a level of silliness that stops me connecting to it.
Because I got some important shit going on here.
I like the soundtrack at points, but it did feel like it could be a bit too overbearing in the more subtle, emotional scenes. I'm glad the Avengers theme was able to breathe and wasn't hidden away like in Age of Ultron. Honestly, I'd be happy if this was the last film in the MCU. It's a fitting ending that rewards your investment based on your level of interacting with the previous movies. The fact that there can still be so many different characters, a time travel plot, 20 plus previous movies worth of story, and there's still this level of cohesion is actually mind-blowing to me.
It's like, I was made for this.
If anything, this is an appraisal of the organizational skills of the higher-ups who had to figure out the logistics of how something like this would even be possible to pull off in the first place. Despite my nitpicks and gripes, I had no problem declaring that this is the best superhero movie of 2019. Who would have thought that when you have all the money in the world, you'll be able to make a pretty good live-action adaptation of famous Marvel comic storylines? I just want to quickly shout out The Boys, because I think it's relevant to the video. It's a really good Amazon Prime show that I teased earlier when talking about Brightburn, because The Boys takes the premise of evil or corrupt superheroes and greatly expands it into its own story. It's a highly political and edgy narrative that runs over a concise 8 episodes. The edginess could be a little bit much at times for me, but the sarcastic misery that they present is pretty compelling. The best character is this absolute maniac, who is essentially what would happen if Onision had superpowers. The effects are pretty good considering the scale of the production, and overall it felt like a pretty nice break from the genre trappings for the sake of a tone that vaguely reminds me of what films or shows like Kick-Ass, Watchmen, Hancock, Heroes are all going for. It even reminded me a little bit of The Matrix at points, with the vigilante group going against these seemingly impossible odds. I would say this show is better than most of the superhero movies released in 2019, so check it out if the premise seems epic to you. Remember the controversy of Scorsese saying that Marvel movies are like theme park rides? If you actually read his points in his New York Times article, you'll learn that he's more lamenting how difficult it is for independent projects to get funding because of the homogenized nature of how trends like superheroes have completely engulfed popular cinema. Also, if you're even remotely surprised that Martin Scorsese does not enjoy Avengers Infinity War, then I don't really know what reality you're living in. It's okay to like these movies and still have a problem with the follow the leader mentality that the film industry is known for. Because, you know, theme parks can still be a lot of fun. It's time to look to the near future to see what's to come. Seeing as the pandemic kind of fucked everything, it appears as if a few of the heavy hitters have been delayed. Shit, man, what are we gonna do without the saga of the Eternals, a race of immortal beings who lived on Earth and shaped its history and civilizations? Looking at the lineup, I gotta say, this might turn out to be one of the worst years for these movies in a long time. That's just my prediction though. What a lineup. On the other hand, for every loss that might have brought us to our knees, we have at least gained the Snyder Cut of Justice League. We did it, everybody! Can't say I'm pleased that I'll have to watch Bloodshot though. Well, that's sort of it from me for now. Let me know your own lists in the comments below, and follow me on Letterboxd so you can judge my taste and be mean to me. We'll see you on the next video. Bye!